Liam, thanks so much for making the time today.
No problem.
Awesome. Well, listen, I know you're a very busy man. Looking forward to diving into all things performance nutrition and football here today. But maybe before we jump into this topic, you can give us a little bit more background on yourself and your career path so far.
Yeah, so back in 2009, I started a sports science degree at Liverpool John Moores University. Did that for obviously 3 years. Tried my utmost hardest to get any little snippets of work experience as much as I possibly could, just to try and get my name out there, seeing what worked. Unfortunately, I was relatively unsuccessful. I got weeks work experience at two clubs over here in England, at Blackburn Rovers and Burnley Football Club, working out with their academies there. But generally, it wasn't much. It was sort of going into the clubs and seeing what they're doing. After that, I did my coaching badges. I started my coaching badges whilst working at Everton Football Club as an intern. I got that during my master's year, so I worked with the first team and the academy there during my master year. Then it was sort of, I slid very, very quickly from that. I slid into a PhD as my master's was going on and as the internship at Everton came to an end. So
Nice.
At the PhD, I was very fortunate enough to be working with the first team at Liverpool Football Club. I worked there for 3 years, which was unreal experience. It was, going into work every day, working. I'm also a Liverpool fan, so I was working with my heroes, which
Incredible.
was great. So, working day in, day out there, I started my PhD there whilst working full time at the club. We were researching on the guys, but we were also doing day-to-day roles as well. After that, I took a year out in Hungary. I was working as the head of fitness out at Videoton Football Club. I think they're now rechanged the name as Molvidi. Recently had a good success in the Europa League. After a year, unfortunately, as most things in football, the manager left his position, and unfortunately I went with him. I came back, managed to finish my PhD in 2 months, and started at Crewe Alexandra over here in England, which is quite a traditional English club. I'm now the head of sports science and medicine there. So I've been there now since September 2017. So
Phenomenal.
implement as much as I've learned over time into this role of being in now.
Well, listen, that's incredible, and no better person to talk to around performance nutrition and football. And before we dig into that, I mean, understanding the physical demands of a sport is obviously essential for really providing, evidence-based fueling strategies. So, could you perhaps walk listeners through, a general breakdown of some of the distances covered in a football match? How much low to moderate versus high intensity running, those types of things.
Yeah, sure. So originally, match analysis research, it got started being done over 4 decades ago by Thomas Riley. There's actually pictures of him, I think, on the John Moores website somewhere. You'll be able to find them, where he's actually undertaken a notational analysis at Goodison Park. So it was actually quite interesting that I began my sort of professional career, working at Everton, and he's actually doing his work there. But typically, it's progressed a lot more since then. We now have semi-automatic cameras, or even players wearing GPS in matches now.
Mm-hmm.
So, but typically it's understood that players cover between 10 and 13 kilometres in a match, with distances, high-speed running, which is anything over 19.8 kilometres an hour, or sprinting, which is anything over 25.2 kilometres an hour. 7 to 12% for high-speed running of that total distance, and then 1 to 4% of that total distance sprinting. So it's really not a great deal they spend during those high-intensity moments, but it's these actions which have been proven to be crucial for the sporting performance.
Yeah,
so
it's really interesting, especially when I contrast it as well to basketball in terms of the stops and starts and the accelerations and decelerations. And, I know muscle glycogen is obviously massively affected during a football match. What does that look like for a player who's a starter who's logging, full-time minutes in terms of glycogen status post-match?
Yeah, so I don't actually know this, but my thoughts are that it's very much position specific. So if you've got a centre back, then they won't be covering anywhere near as much distance as a central midfielder. Nowhere near as much distance at high speed running, but they'll be doing a lot more, accelerations where they're jockeying backwards and forwards and pressing attackers, them sorts of motions. So, they'll probably have muscle glycogen stores of around 400 millimoles per kilo of dry weight muscle. And at half time, they've been found in a classical research study by Salton back in 1973, that they were almost depleted even just at half time, and then completely depleted at the end of the match.
Wow.
So, and then skipping forward 33 years, Peter Krustrup did a study on, I think it was Danish players. He found that they started the match with 150 millimoles of dry weight per kilo of dry weight in the muscle, and then that decreased to 225 at the end of the match. Now, when I first seen that, I was thinking, but surely they're not depleted because they've still got actual carbohydrates in the muscle. Mm-hmm. But if you look further into that, the muscle fibers which are responsible for high speed running, high intensity actions, which was the type 2A and type 2X fibers, they were almost 50% of them were depleted, completely depleted.
Wow.
So if they're the muscles which are responsible for, they're the fibers which are responsible for high speed running and sprinting, those high intensity actions, and they're completely depleted at the end of the football match. Surely we need to be doing something to stop this.
Yeah, I mean, it's really fascinating, and of course, changes in game frequency and the associated training loads here in game and practice obviously have implications here in the nutrition strategies. Given that the metabolic demands, the daily energy expenditure are so high. So, you've done some work, of course, in terms of specific weekly training scenarios. So, work on 1 game, 2 game, 3 game per week schedule. So how does that flush out in terms of, what you found in your work and how it impacts a football player?
Yeah. So, we found that this was one of my first studies in my PhD, and it went back, and we didn't actually know what does a footballer do in a typical week. So we wanted to find out, okay, how much total distance do they do? How much high-speed running do they do? What is the major percentage? The major percentage of that done in training, or is the major percentage of that done in match play? So we got looking at training load within the season, and James Morton, who was the sports nutritionist, is now Professor James Morton at Liverpool John Moores. He's done a lot of work now with Team Sky and Science in Sport. So he was the nutritionist at the club, and he was asking me, what do these lads actually do? How are we quantifying that? And there was no real formal documentation in and around that. So he was asking me, how can we give nutritional guidelines to players when we don't actually know what they're doing? And at the time,
makes sense.
Yeah, so there wasn't much research out there around training load at all, really. So we wanted to look at how does the game frequency, how does the build-up of fixtures change what the lads are actually expending? What is that leading to? More high-speed running because they've got 2 games in a week instead of 3. Is that, or are they getting more sprinting? What is that actually doing for them? Are they getting more recovery sessions in, so everything's done by matches, or is everything done in training? Is the training session matching what they would get in a typical game? And we found that a lot of the total distance was getting done in the 3 game per week than it was in the 1 game per week, even though they had those training sessions. And then also we had the high speed running and sprinting a lot more was getting done in the 3 game week than the 1 game week, which when you sit down and think about it, if they're playing 3 games in the space of 7 days, it probably makes sense, but no one had ever actually told us this. We just assumed it, so we wanted to document it and put it out there. And then we also wanted to look at how that training week sort of went with regards to periodization. Typically, when it was Saturday, so they've got a Saturday game, they've got 2 days off after the match to completely recover. Then they come in, if they get in on a Saturday, they come in on the Tuesday, and then they work through a 4-day lead in match day minus 4, 3, 2, 1 into the Saturday again. So is there any strategies that we could potentially put in place? Because if the training load is nowhere near as high as what it would be in a 2-game or 3-game week, we could potentially reduce the carbohydrates in that week in order to facilitate adaptations.
Absolutely.
So yeah, and we wanted to facilitate the adaptations. We basically found that in those 1 game per week scenarios that they only ran 3 to 5 kilometers. So we were thinking 3 to 5k when instead they're doing, some of these guys at the top level are doing 13 kilometers in a match. It's likelihood that these sessions, they might be intense, but they're not nowhere near going to be depleting muscle glycogen, or they're not going to need that. If they're no longer than an hour, they're not going to be even need to take any fluid, any carbohydrates on board during the training session itself.
Yeah, it's amazing when you start to quantify these things and really put a number to what's going on, that you start to it really opens your eyes to how different fueling strategies can be changed and modified and improved to impact those adaptations, and especially in training, right?
Yeah, so we stepped into this study, and I think when we started this study, there may have been four studies done. One which wasn't even published at the time. It got published after it, but it was someone who worked at Liverpool before us who did one of the studies. So that made us aware of the sort of training demands. And then obviously with GPS, we knew the sort of training demands as well. But there was nothing documented. There was nothing set in stone to send out to other clubs to say this is what the training demands are. And what are we actually fueling for?
I mean, it's a great question, the idea of what are we actually fueling for, and it's definitely one that, in the NBA, you talk about this idea of having some data on what the athletes are actually doing, and that's something that, a lot of sports scientists are just trying to get a hold of. And if we think of the stop and start nature, the accelerations and decelerations, and, if you're reporting in football, 50% of those fast twitch fibers being empty or partially empty, Liam, if you had to speculate here a little bit around, professional basketball, what would you think would be some of the implications there for these players who are logging 2 or 3 games a week?
Yeah, you can imagine that if these guys aren't replenishing their glycogen stores after matches, then they're likely going to be starting the next competitive game without maximised muscle glycogen stores. And I don't know what that would do chronically to players, if they are. And it's likely that they're probably a little bit like the studies which I did. They probably eat a lot more on game day. That's perceived as a training day, as a day where they need to eat more because they have a higher load that day. But then, even on the training days, they should be still probably eating the same amount of carbohydrates as they are on that match day.
Yeah, it's impressive, especially with the back-to-backs that they'll play as well, and getting on a plane late at night and going to a new town, and then again playing another game less than 24 hours after the initial one.
That's actually brings me on to a point. It came up in we did a study on the meal distribution of the players, so how that comes about. So what does the training day look like? What does the protein distribution look like at breakfast, dinner? I'll speak proper English. Breakfast, lunch, and evening meal. And how is that skewed? So are they eating a lot more in their evening meal? Should they be eating a lot more with the lunch because that's just after training? Should they be fueling the training session if it's going to be a tough training session a little bit more before, or should they be going even low carb if it's going to be a light training session? How are they doing that? And then also, what are they doing before and after the matches? And in one of the studies, I think it was day 2 on the meal distribution study, that was a night game at home, and the players, there was food available to players after that night game, but it wasn't compulsory to go in to eat. Mm-hmm. So if that's not compulsory, the players are just going to go home. And they went home, they maybe had a protein shake or a recovery shake, maybe a couple of slices of pizza after the game, which was in the changing rooms. And then as soon as they did that, they went home and didn't eat anything until the following morning for breakfast. But these guys have got to play a game in another 2 days. And, since 2001, we've known that we need to replenish muscle glycogen stores by giving them 1.2 grams per kilo of carbohydrates every hour for the next 4 hours. So from that study, we put in a process in place in order to try to get them that 1.2 grams per kilo.
And Liam, does that involve things, immediately post-game around some liquid nutrition and then adding on some, the meals afterwards, or what are some strategies that you might use?
Yeah, you can pretty much get recovery shakes now if you shop in the right place that near enough give you that 1.2 grams per kilo. And then, it might be some chicken goujons or, anything after the game that they can eat immediately. But a lot of the players after they played, I'm sure it's the same in basketball as well. They're
not hungry.
Not hungry.
Ironically,
as a nutritionist, you're pulling your hair out. You're thinking, please just eat. Well, they say they're not hungry, and but if you can get that shake on board with them, then you say, okay, if you're not hungry, and don't eat for another hour then, because that's when you need to eat. So then have your meal in an hour after that. But we come up with ways like giving players recovery packs to go home with, which might have had some fruit in it, maybe apple juice, like a carbohydrate bar, like a muesli bar, and things like that, but even Haribo sweets, things like that they're going to eat.
Incentivize them to get those carbohydrates in, right?
Just get as much carbohydrates as they can into the muscles after the match and make them eat, really. But that's something that I've brought forward even in the fourth tier of the Football League, and we have at the minute we have post-match like specific meal preps for each player depending on their weight. So they put in an order to me what they want, and I work out how much carbohydrates. This is every week, so I work out how much carbohydrates they need after the game, and then they have a protein shake, and then they take away the post-match meal, and I tell them to have it an hour later as soon as the match finished. So that's just a way that I can tick off the first 2 hours, which are controllable to me, and they take that away. And then if they're really clued on, they know that they need to be taking on lots of fluids and taking on extra carbohydrates in the hours after that as well.
Yeah, it's such a key part, isn't it, to control the controllables like you're doing there in terms of the hours that you can really influence them, which is that immediate post-game, and then, as you mentioned, giving them that pack of food to be able to take home, and hopefully they're going to be eating that as well. And so at least you've covered some bases there, which, again, I think for a lot of folks listening in who would always be assuming that players are just going to automatically be hyper compliant to all these things. I mean, at the end of the day, they're humans too, I guess, right? And a lot of them are pretty young as well, and can kind of get away with things or feel like they get away with things, and that sets up some roadblocks and challenges for performance nutritionists, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, I don't think they don't want to be compliant, but I've never played at the top level. I've never competed at the top level. I don't really know what it is like to play 90 minutes of that intense football and how my stomach's going to feel after it. And one player is different to the next. So, we get some players after the game that all they want to do is eat. But then some players will just literally sit in the corner and sit on the phone and slowly chug down the recovery shake. So it really is, it goes down to an individual level. And I sort of seen that in the study what I did, because we, obviously, if you're conducting a study, we're not allowed to influence them in any way of what they're eating. It was their habitual intake and what they wanted to eat at that time. So it was kind of interesting. You got let into some players' lives for a week. So
absolutely.
Eating.
I mean, it's fascinating to me as well, because obviously there's a lot of dovetails between football, or in America we call it soccer. Sorry about that. And basketball with just the way that in terms of the athletes, the players, and everything else. And this dovetails really into talking about your work in the English Premier League players, where you in terms of evaluating the amounts of daily energy expenditure for one, but then again the amounts of total protein and carbohydrate and fat that they were taking in. Can you walk listeners through that?
Yeah, so one of the first, it was my third study of my PhD, and the aim of that study was to quantify the energy intake expenditure, training load, and match load during a 7-day in-season period. Originally, it was meant to be 2 weeks, but we felt like it was a little bit too invasive on the players, because I didn't realise how often these guys ate, to be honest. So I was getting picture messages, diary updates, having to do 24-hour recalls with them every morning, and towards the end of the study, they were probably getting a little bit stressed, which brings me on to why this study was the third study. I did the study in November 2015, I think it was. And I'd been at the club for 2.5 years then. And I think if you speak to anyone, if you go into a club in your first season, or you've been there for 6 months or 2 weeks or a month, and you try to do this with players,
no chance, right?
Got no chance. So we always had this study in mind, but I had to build the relationships. I had to build up those soft skills. I had to, professional relationships, which we trying to undergo with them was key to the study. And I think that's why you can write your methodology of a study to be able to repeat again. But if you don't have that relationship with the players, then it'd be very difficult.
Yeah, it's amazing how the relationship part of this is really massive. And as you mentioned, I mean, even for the general public to say, hey, I want you to take pictures of everything you eat for 7 days, or right, give me the dietary recall 24 hours for 7 days. It's funny how you think it's easy after day 1 and day 2, and then by the time you get to day 5 or 6, it becomes a real chore, right?
I was doing that whilst also asking them to give me their second urine of the day every day for 2 weeks as well. So I think sort of saying by the 7th day, enough's enough. Come on, and okay, I'll hold my hands up. I'll take 7 days and run with it. So we still did collect the energy expenditure off them for 2 weeks.
Yep.
So we wanted to look if there was any week-to-week differences, which there wasn't much, to be honest. Changes when I think we played another 2 competitive games that next week as well. So again, there wasn't much training going on. It was just match, rest, match. But what was good about this study was we quantified the training load, so we knew how much they were doing, which wasn't a lot in training. It was, you're performing 2 matches a week, which I've already mentioned, 10 to 12k, so 10 to 13 kilometers for players. 13-14% of that is high intensity distance above. And we found that they were fueling only really on the days. They weren't really going out with the weigher much. Maybe it was their evening meal, which was the majority of their carbohydrates, if they found out if they're in the squad for the next day. So they find out they're in the squad for the next day of the after the training session. They go home and then they have, starter, main and dessert of all high carbohydrates with a fruit juice, which was key for them to be able to come in and have at least some sort of levels of glycogen the following day. But we found that they were expending just 3,560 calories a day. That was the mean energy expenditure, which my initial thoughts was very high because they've only played 2 games and the training sessions have been really low intensity. They haven't done much. So those games must be taking a lot out of them. This is average data, by the way, for the 7 days. So the double labelled water isn't sensitive enough to get day to day. So we had to take the full week and then average that, and then also take the total energy expenditure the full week, energy intake the full week, and average that as well. But what I think is important to know from this study is the range of energy expenditures was 3,047 calories a day, right up to 4,400 calories a day.
Yeah, it's a pretty wide margin, right?
Yeah, so the guy who was this 4,400 calories, I sat down with him after study and said, listen, what are you doing? Because you're doing nothing in games. He's a centre-back.
Nice.
You're doing nothing in games. You've only trained 2 sessions all week. You never even played in the first game. You were sub. And so what are you doing? He was the heaviest player out of them all, but I was still like 4,400 calories is a lot. And he came out and said to me, he said, I've had a really busy week. I've got family over. from his home country.
Interesting.
So he's a really busy. He's got family over. He's been taking them around all the sites of Liverpool. He's been playing with the kids and the young kids of the family at home. He's been up an extra hour longer than what he's usually awake. And I'm thinking,
he's getting his 15,000 steps in there, huh?
You're getting all these extra calories that you're nowhere near consuming enough in this week because you've got family over from your other country. It's not because of your training load or your match load. So that for me was like, wow. It basically opened me out. We can monitor these players all we want with the GPS, any monitoring blood, saliva, anything we want, but we only have them for something like 15% of the day when they're with us. But when we can actually monitor them and see what they're doing, we're usually on match day when we have them from 9 o'clock in the morning. If a game's at 4 o'clock, they were in this particular season. They were reporting at 9 o'clock in the morning for breakfast. We've got them for breakfast pre-match, and then there's a post-match meal available for them as well. If it's an evening game, we've got them from 9 o'clock in the morning again, breakfast, very extremely light training session, more just like a walkthrough, dinner, pre-match meal, post-match meal. So like it's the times when we're controlling it, they're getting in what we want them to get in. So that was quite interesting for me.
I mean, that's fascinating because it definitely is that piece of, the athlete training load is one thing, and then there's a whole life load and the emotional stress and everything else, and even just the idea that people are coming over to visit, and all of a sudden, the daily energy expenditure jumps by 15% or whatever it might be. I mean, that's a big maybe a nice heuristic for people that are listening in to say, hey, if people are having family over, we got to bump up the overall intake just to cope with visitors.
Like he says, he was just walking around Liverpool for 3 days of the whole week. Like that's all he was doing when he was outside of training. I'm like, Jesus. But that's what his goal was. So, but then if that takes us back to the original point, if we never had this relationships with the players, for me then to sit down with him after that and say, listen, why is yours so much higher than everyone else's when you've done nothing in training? If we'd have taken that as the gospel truth and said, yeah, you burn 4,400 calories on average a day, here's a diet plan, and then he comes back 4 months later looking not very lean.
A little soft, right? A little soft after that, I think.
He'll be saying, you told me to eat it. And I'll be like, yeah, I did, but I didn't mean you to get fat.
Yeah. I mean, that's a phenomenal point. It really is so important to consider the rest of the day and the rest of the athlete's life. And as you mentioned, just being able to have that relationship with the athlete, to be able to have that really frank conversation to say, hey, what's going on here? We got a bit of an outlier. Can you fill me in on the rest of your life and day? And of course, obviously in that scenario, he does. And it really opens your eyes to, okay, this is what's going on. And Liam, in terms of when we look at football in general with that study, in terms of daily energy intake, are there some general numbers here with, carbohydrate intake or protein intake or caloric intake in terms of daily or weekly that you were observing in these professional EPL players?
Yeah, so I think I mentioned before that the mean energy intake was nearly 3,200 calories. That was their average. And then compared to their energy expenditure was 3,560. Statistically, it wasn't statistically different, but obviously if someone's under-eating by 400 calories a day, then over time they're going to have a negative impact on performance. That could be through the way, just error in my and other people's, the way we undertook the analysis on the food intake, or they're under-reporting that intake as well. So they might not be showing us the things that they don't know consumes calories, like
Sure.
Drinks. If one of the players might not know they're consuming a drink, so they've not sent the pictures or forgot about it, or they've had something immediately upon waking and forgot, or anything like that, or for example, they've had a chocolate bar and they don't want to say. So
yeah, for sure.
That sort of things, I'm sure they happen, and that sort that sort of stuff might just alter the results a little bit. But so my guess that because none of the players lost any significant weight over the week, they all stayed the same. Some actually went up. That they are probably meeting the demands just, and that was seen by the change in carbohydrate intake. Even on match days, we were working off 6.4 grams per kilo. Typically, that's on average, but that's got an SD of 2.2. So I think one player was only eating 4 grams per kilo on match day. So he's nowhere near fueling for that match on that match day. So we took these results on an individual basis, and then we went and looked at that with that particular player to say, listen, on match day your carbohydrate intake needs to increase. We had one player who's a centre midfielder, and he was eating, I think he was nearly 8 grams per kilo, if I remember correctly. But even on training days, they're on average they're eating 4.2. So is that enough? My guess is probably not, because in 2 days' time they've got to go again. So I don't think that's enough to fully replenish their muscle glycogen. But it does show that they're subconsciously thinking about some sort of carbohydrate periodization, which I think is a good aspect to have, especially when you get into a 1-game week. It just so happens that this team I don't think they've had much 1-game week since we've done this study, because of domestic and European competitions.
Yeah, it's interesting to see whether, to hear your comments around, if that sort of nutrition periodization is happening because players are, inherently doing that based on how they feel through the week, whether it's, the impact of the performance nutritionists like yourself on the team, whether it's the impact of even trends in social media or trends in nutrition, in terms of lower carbohydrate, and therefore they're deviating to certain practices. In terms of your view on that, is there a collection of a little bit of all these different things happening? Is there a strategic strategy here? Or?
I think it is, and I think it goes back again to the when did the club have control of them, and how good is the sports nutritionist at designing the menus which are there for the players? So is the menu which is for breakfast high carbohydrate, and do they have those options to them? Is the chef at the club, is he fully aware of what they need to be doing on that particular day? Should the chef even have the team sheet in the morning to say, okay, these 11 players are starting, I need to put bigger portion sizes into their, I don't know, they need to have more pancakes in the morning, for example, of the morning of the match. So everything comes down to, how much do people know, and how much should they be eating? Again, I think if the player knows, then he's automatically going to do it, and that comes again with experience. If you've got, I'm pretty certain, and I know one player that we work with. If it was a 7:45 kickoff in the evening, so a typical European game at the time, he'd have 2 pieces of toast for his breakfast and drink tea for the rest of the day, and wouldn't have anything else. And he says that's how he's played his entire life, and I'm talking top player. Mm-hmm. So who are we, if he's got to where he is now doing that, who are we to go and say, well, I think you should be eating 10 times as much as that?
Yeah, it definitely gets back to that question, and again, that sort of similarity with basketball and players being able to seemingly almost get away with genetics and gifts and things like that. That's gotten to a certain level, and yet when you look at their intake, you just think, geez, you didn't even eat breakfast, and we've trained for 2 hours, and now we have an intense game, and you've had half a cup of rice. It just seems like a real opportunity here, which seems to be what you're implying, right?
Yeah, well, we had some players came in the morning after a game, and if they hadn't sent me a photograph, I assumed that they'd either forgot or they'd not had breakfast. But that was what the 24-hour recall was for. So when they arrived at the training ground, I said, have you had breakfast? No. Are you going to have it now? No, I'm going to train. And you're like, no, you're on a recovery day anyway, so your best option now is to go upstairs and have some breakfast. And I just found it phenomenal, really, that was the case. But that was about educating them, and that's sort of why we did this study as well, because I think players can often go under the radar, and if they are, then that can lead to performance decrements. I've had a player in League Two this year, and I've been monitoring his skin folds all season, and using the equation he's been coming out at. He started the season, I think it was 9.5%, and he's finished the season on 7.9. And for me, I'm like, you're massively under-consuming of what you're eating, because you've lost weight, you don't look like you're put on any lean, and your skin folds have plummeted throughout the season. And that's seen then speaking to the coach. He also agrees in his performance. So we've had to put in different nutritional strategies throughout his week, which ensure he's getting enough calories in the day and enough carbohydrates and enough protein to repair and recover.
Yeah, I mean that's a great observation, and it's definitely something that I see in NBA players of just that getting leaner as the season progresses and losing in terms of total mass and lean muscle mass, and you think, wait a minute, we're just underfueling here. How can we start to get more on board for some of these guys, especially with all the travel and everything else, right?
Yeah. To be honest, I think he's one of the only League Two players that have had to say, you need to eat more, you're not fat. So
it's always tough on a team when there's guys going in one direction and other guys on the team at the end of the buffet who need to go in another direction, for sure. And I was going to ask you, Liam, in terms of the team chef is actually such a key player in all this, isn't it? I mean, how the food tastes. They're the ones who are designing sort of the menus per se. In conjunction with the nutritionist, but they have a lot of say in terms of the style of food that's being put out, and it's a first line person here that's delivering this nutrition. So how important is that relationship between performance nutritionist and chef? Because even in some major clubs in North America, it's almost defaulted to the team chef to start making some of these decisions rather than even strictly the performance nutritionist.
And I think it's key, because if the food's not very nice, they won't eat in the club unless it's made compulsory. But then if it's not very nice, they're not going to eat very much of it. So the chef needs to be a top class chef in the professional club. Now, when and where and why they're eating certain things, I think that needs to be down to the relationship with the nutritionist and the chef. So I know our sports nutritionist at Liverpool at the time was James Moore, and he used to sit down with the chef once every 2 weeks and go through the plan for the next 4 weeks. He was always working 2 weeks behind, and then whatever the training load was like, which is why we sort of did these studies, so we can, okay, we've got a 1 game per week there. We're working Saturday to Saturday. On the Tuesday and Wednesday, we want to have a moderate carbohydrate lunch. So we won't be putting dishes like a pasta bake and loads of bread and all that available to them. There's going to be like lean meats with small amounts of pasta, and then there's going to be things on the top which shows them certain portion sizes which they should be having on that day, depending on how much what their body weight is. So that was a big thing, and not even just the chef, it's just all the kitchen staff. So the people who are serving the food, people who are cooking the food, people who are telling the people what to cook in the food. But it's ultimately down to the chef to be able to get them to eat it. So I think without the good relationship with the performance nutritionist and the chef, I don't think it could work very well. I'm not a chef, and I don't think the nutritionist who was at Liverpool at the time, he's not a chef, but he says we need something with as maximum carbohydrates as we can. We're playing a game tomorrow. He can make up things, and we were putting in different strategies like low-fat apple crumble and custard the evening before games to get them to eat that sort of dessert. And we had one of the chefs go into individual players' houses and teaching the wives how to cook. So what they're cooking for them, and then they have a schedule given to them on what sort of things they should be having on each day.
Yeah, it's tremendous in terms of it being able to influence the environment, not only at the club, but then with family members and everything else is, phenomenal in terms of being able to do that. So, great
Yeah, but
point there.
yeah. So for me, I look into it from both. I look from a sports science and a sports nutrition perspective because I think they go. I don't think it should be separate because if you look at any sports scientist, the nutritionist is very, very rarely, maybe at the top 5 clubs in England, they will be there all the time. So a lot of the time, it's the sports scientist who's there, and he's giving the protein shakes out. He's giving the recovery packs out. He's the one, I don't know, telling the chefs what time they can have the meals on the bus on the way home, because not everyone's clued up as much as what the performance nutritionist is. And by all means, they probably have a performance nutrition in, but they will be in maybe 2 days a week in England, and they have to work around that.
Yeah, it is amazing considering all the demands and all the potential gains of that can be had. And I've been fascinated by all the work that you guys have done, and in terms of quantifying all this, and with football, and so much dovetailing in terms of basketball. And I recently had Dr. Samuel Impey on the podcast discussing this concept, fueling for the work required, which obviously with his work with James Morton and your relationship with them as well. So in a team sport concept, and I was asking Sam a little bit about this. You've touched on it here a little bit in terms of some auto regulation that happens throughout the week, in terms of lowering through the week, and then obviously higher on match day. Compared to endurance, are there potentially, just as many gains to be had? Is there a significant amount of gains to be had? Is this something that's happening just intuitively from the players, or what are your thoughts there on fueling for the work required when it comes to team sport athletes?
Well, with regards to your last point, I think it is very much intuitively with the players. There's one more interesting point on the doubly labelled water study, which we did. So on the last day, which was day 7, the 2 games we studied were home games. On the last game we studied was the day before an away game, so they travelled. Now their energy intake on that training day was higher than any of the other training days in the week, the days before the games. So that, for me, again, it shows how much control the club's number one chefs, the nutritionists, the sports scientists, they have over this, and even the manager. Because if the manager says, "No, we're going to travel on the day instead," okay, but you could be sacrificing without traveling. And I get the aspect of the stress of traveling and things like that, but without traveling, we're missing out on 1.5 grams per kilo for every player because they're not having that extra meal, which they're having on the away trip with us. So it all reverts back to that. I think they do understand, but I think with endurance athletes, they understand to a greater extent the benefits of not only what high carb days do for you, but also low carb days, and when to manipulate them during their microcycle or mesocycle or even day. So you can probably find if they go on 2 rides in the day, they might go out in the morning completely depleted and have the ride then, and then start fueling up for their afternoon ride, which is going to be a lot quicker and need a lot more power output from that. So I think that naturally footballers have got more intuitive and that auto-regulation over time. And I think you can see that a little bit from one of Tom Riley's papers. He looked at energy intakes and expenditures back in 1979. And off the top of my head, protein intakes were around 1 gram per kilo. It's going off subject a little bit, but no, I think in my study there were 2.6 grams per kilo.
Yeah, it's amazing how the environment just changed that, isn't it? In the last couple of decades, of just protein is really accounted for now, isn't it?
But now these players are now so much more aware of the benefits of protein, either through personal education or, marketing from protein firms or whatever it is.
Yeah, peers and social media and the whole collection of everything, right?
coming into the game and being more aware and research. But these guys are so much more aware. Instead of just having a bowl of pasta, they're having the chicken breast with the bowl of pasta as well. Or so I think it's just come so much more from just just go out there and eat pasta and potatoes, because that's what you need. That's what you need for energy.
Yeah, it's a fascinating topic, and definitely, I had Trent Stellingworth on not too long ago, and he'd mentioned that athletes train 200 to 300 times a year, but they eat 1,400 to 1,600 times a year. So there's a lot of room in there to influence. And Liam, on that note, as we wrap things up here, when we look at the evolution of performance in this sort of area, where do you see things going in the next 3, 5, even 10 years time?
Well, I think now this is it's gonna have to take a very good relationship with either a head coach, or it's gonna get done in an academy setting first, or maybe even a semi-professional team that might be training full time. But we still don't actually know what a training session is costing a player in muscle glycogen. So we're giving these recommendations out based on work rate data through GPS and semi-automatic cameras, but we don't actually know what the top players are burning in a typical training session. So the player might do 5.5K in a training session, and he's training for 70 minutes. Now he might cover 800 meters high speed running in that session, or he might not cover any high speed running at all, and a lot of his work be accelerations, deaccelerations, which is more the intensive access to the sport. But do either of those two training sessions, if it's a different training session, so more of an intensive training session, is that affecting muscle glycogen more than what the extensive session is? Or is the extensive session, that's the one that's depleting the muscle glycogen? So should we be providing more carbohydrates after that session than the Tuesday session? And is the Tuesday session where we can get a lot of adaptations, where we can not provide as much carbohydrates and restrict it after training? And then also I think that, how is that affected then during the week? So if we perform a full week's worth of training, if we can then biopsy players or students or whatever it is, how is their muscle glycogen affected each day? So we mentioned it a little bit before. So you asked me if the basketball players have 2 days in between the games, are they going into the next game with muscle glycogen? The answer is we don't know, because we've not studied it yet. So is the 4.6 grams per kilo, what these lads are eating on the training days in between the games, enough to maximise the muscle glycogen stores to go back in? Now, we assume so, because we don't see any significant performance decrements, but are we missing a trick by not doing it? And then what I'd want to then know is, so for example, in a 1-game week, is the carbohydrate intake on that Tuesday and Wednesday, if we have a low carb day, is that going to augment the molecular regulators, for example, mitochondrial biogenesis? Is that going to decrease it? Because in football, we don't know. We know in cycling, we know in endurance running that it does, but in football training, we don't actually know if that works or not. But it's something that we're implementing just because we think it's working, because it's a sport. But in my opinion, football is a lot more complex than endurance sports. So, because you have to have a lot more for it in order to try to do that. And then I think lastly, what is the chronic effects of this? If we do that for an entire season, what is are we getting increased fitness adaptations from that? From training low every Tuesday, every Wednesday? Or have we had more illness instances this season, for example, if we've been doing that compared to previous seasons when we've not been doing it? Because, as you well know, with training with low muscle glycogen and low glycogen availability, then the players are more likely to get ill. So there's finding the right balance, I think. I think there's 3 or 4 studies within that area there that we can look at.
Liam, this is fascinating stuff, and definitely an area that I'm obviously really Keenan, and I could ask you questions for hours and hours here, but I want to respect your time because I know you're a busy man and you carved out some time here to be with us today. So, definitely really appreciate you making some time. And where can people stay connected with you and keep up with all your fantastic work?
Yeah, so I think like most people, probably Twitter is the best way of contacting me. It's I think the handle is Liam_Anderson5 off the top of my head. If not, I can give you the link to put it in any bio or anything like that after we're finished.
Fantastic. Well, we'll definitely include that in the show notes. And again, Liam, massive thank you for taking the time out today, and best of luck with the rest of the season.